What are all these tests, and why are we just looking at TSH? Over the past few years, I've come across a whole ream of other thyroid tests, largely through patients rather than through professional channels. Tests I would never really order, and I want to achieve 3 things today with this video. I'll try to explain the tests that doctors look at and why they look at them. I'll also go through a number of other tests that are frequently mentioned but rarely actually done. And I want to end by going through 4 additional tests that I think are super important that nobody seems to be talking about. Thyroid symptoms are non-specific. By that I mean they can't be relied on to actually make a diagnosis themselves. Sure, an underactive thyroid can cause weight gain, tiredness, low mood, cold sensitivity, but having those symptoms doesn't mean you've got an underactive thyroid. So we really depend on blood tests, don't we, to make a diagnosis at least. The thing is, there are just so many different tests to choose from, and an obvious question that arises from that is, with all those options, why do doctors only depend on one test, the TSH at least initially, which isn't even a thyroid hormone? It's a brain hormone. So let's have a look at the main players, who they are and what they do, and that should help us understand the main tests. So, here it is. Head office, the pituitary gland in the brain, produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, and it sends this down the bloodstream, where it eventually reaches the thyroid gland, the factory. TSH demands that your thyroid gland produces more thyroid hormone, and it does. 10% of the hormone it produces is called T3, and 90% of it is called T4. T3 is for energy. It goes to every cell in your body and regulates how quickly we burn through energy. T4, if you need more, it's there in reserve, ready to be converted to T3 when needed. Right, now that we have an idea of that, let's look at some of the blood tests. If your thyroid gland is underactive, it is what it says on the tin. It's not producing enough of the thyroid hormone. So a low thyroid hormone level, T3 and that T4, that means you've got an underactive thyroid. And in a way, it's as simple as that. But bear with me a moment while we just have a look at what that other hormone, the TSH, the one doctors always measure, let's just see what happens to that hormone in this situation. When head office, the pituitary gland, gets word that production is slacking and thyroid hormone is reducing, it will send out more and more TSH to stimulate your thyroid gland and wake it up and kick it into action. In this condition though, true overt hypothyroidism, no matter how much TSH we send, the thyroid is just incapable of producing enough thyroid hormone. The factory has essentially half shut down. So if T3 and T4 are low, you've got an underactive thyroid. It's a diagnosis. So clearly T3 and T4 are very important tests. Well, yes, but no. Let me explain why doctors prefer the TSH over both of those tests. T3 for energy, the active version of thyroid hormone. It's true that if this hormone is low, then you have an underactive thyroid. But it's not always low when you've got an underactive thyroid. So T4, do you want more, will convert itself to T3 to keep levels high. So if the thyroid is struggling and not managing to produce enough hormone, T4 will sacrifice itself to keep T3 levels higher. So low T3 means an underactive thyroid. Normal T3 doesn't necessarily mean normal. So on to T4 and its potential pitfalls. Well, unlike T3, in an underactive thyroid gland, your T4 will be low. But what if your T4 is normal? Does that mean everything's normal? Well, not necessarily. Because the thyroid can be pumping out the right amount of hormones that it's supposed to do, but if we look back at TSH and it's super high, having to kick the thyroid to pump and pump, and it's just about getting the right amount of levels out, then that's not normal. That's a sluggish thyroid or subclinical hypothyroidism. So here's what I think are the two reasons that doctors prefer TSH over T3, T4 to at least start with. Number one, it's more sensitive than T3, T4. In other words, it's the first thing you'll see going wrong if your thyroid is underactive. If there's a hint of anything about to happen to T3, T4, your TSH will jump up in response to that. The second big reason is you can trust a normal TSH by and large. A normal TSH generally means a normal thyroid. A normal T3, T4 doesn't necessarily mean a normal thyroid, as I've gone through. So we've gone through what I think are the three best tests for identifying if something's going on with your thyroid gland. Anti-TPO antibodies are about finding out why that has happened. This test is usually positive when the immune system has attacked the thyroid gland. And this is actually the case most of the time in people who have an underactive thyroid. It has a few useful utilities in particular, more so in subclinical hypothyroidism. And that's where your thyroid's working okay, but it's a little bit sluggish. If this antibody test is positive, chances are, unfortunately, that your thyroid will eventually become underactive at some point in the future rather than recover. So that's a useful thing to know. It's also good for identifying the cause of the underactive thyroid gland or when there's other reasons that it might be underactive. For example, if someone's on a medication that can make your thyroid underactive, is it the medication that's doing it, or is it your immune system that's doing it? It's a good test to figure that one out. It also tends to be utilized if you've got a goiter, a swollen gland, or you're pregnant. So on the surface, this sort of makes sense because we know that iodine is an absolutely essential mineral to make thyroid hormone. And we also know that worldwide, iodine deficiency is probably the most common cause of having an underactive thyroid. But in more well-off developed countries, our diets tend to be sufficient with iodine. It's added to lots of food, it's even added to tap water, and the UK has been declared iodine sufficient. So for this reason, it's not really worthwhile measuring because none of us in the UK, at least, should be iodine deficient. This is another antibody test like TPO, but this one is used mainly in Graves' disease, so it's used to investigate an overactive thyroid as opposed to an underactive thyroid. Thyroglobulin is this protein that's made by the thyroid gland, but it doesn't have a lot of utility in assessing the function of it. It's more to assess how rapidly it might be dividing, and that's something that's really useful in monitoring cancer, but not in monitoring its function in terms of its ability to make thyroid hormones and what we're talking about today. This is another antibody test, and this has some relevance to assessing an underactive thyroid because it's another test to see if the cause of your underactive thyroid is autoimmune. The thing is, it's also high in a number of other conditions, and in fact, up to 20% of women will have a high level despite nothing being wrong with their thyroid anyway. Long story short, anti-TPO antibody is a much better test than this antibody test. So, go for the good one, not the bad one. So, I'm going to just spend a minute or so on this test because, to be honest, it confused me. And when I started to learn about it, it made sense, and then it didn't make sense. You remember that I discussed T4 earlier on, T4 do you want more, and its ability to convert itself to T3 for energy. Well, it turns out T4 can be turned into an almost identical version of T3 called reverse T3, which isn't for energy. This one is biologically inactive. In other words, it's a dud. So why would our bodies make this seemingly useless hormone? Well, it looks like it might be a self-defense mechanism that our cells use to avoid getting flooded with too much of that hormone T3. Reverse T3 would mean it doesn't have to burn out of control. So In other words, it's a way for the cells to conserve energy. So the theory behind measuring these levels in someone with an underactive thyroid, well, if you've got huge levels of this dud hormone floating around your body doing nothing, then that's inevitably going to make you feel like you've got an underactive thyroid because you've got lots of useless thyroid hormone floating around, which made sense to me. But as I've started to learn, it's not that simple. This test can be high for a whole number of reasons, including just being very hungry. Remember I said the body uses this dud hormone to conserve energy? Just like if you hadn't been eating anything, it would make sense to have a bit more of this dud hormone floating around. The test is also expensive. It's not widely available. It's very difficult to measure the levels, and misinterpretation of the results often leads to over-treating what is actually a normal thyroid gland. So the research says that at the moment anyway, this test doesn't have a role. An ultrasound is a very good scan for assessing what the thyroid actually looks like, what it looks like, rather than assessing how it functions. So it's useful if you've got a lump on your thyroid and looking at that lump to see if it's normal or not, but it won't tell you anything about whether it's producing enough hormone. As opposed to the ultrasound scan, which assesses what the thyroid looks like, this type of scan assesses how it functions, but its use tends to be in assessing overactive thyroids, like in Graves' disease, to try and figure out if there are little parts of the thyroid that are specifically overactive. So it's not commonly used to assess an underactive thyroid. Okay, here are 4 tests that I think are really, really important that I don't seem to hear people talking about enough. The first one is a full blood count to see if you're anemic, if you've got a low hemoglobin, for a couple of reasons. One is that an underactive thyroid can actually lead to you being anemic. And the second is, if you think of what the symptoms of an underactive thyroid are, largely being tired, a low hemoglobin is also a cause of the symptoms. So an underactive thyroid can cause a low hemoglobin, but a low hemoglobin can cause the symptoms of a low thyroid. Chances are you've already had this done because it's such a common test. Lipids, cholesterol. An underactive thyroid can cause your bad cholesterol to increase, and that increases the chances of you having a heart attack and stroke. So to me, that's also an important test. So the last 2 tests are related to why people get an underactive thyroid gland. Remember I said that the most common cause is autoimmune, your immune system attacking your thyroid gland. Well, it turns out if you're susceptible to having one autoimmune condition, you're actually susceptible to having another. So type 1 diabetes is when your own immune system attacks your own pancreas. Sound familiar? And type 2 diabetes is often where you put on weight and your pancreas can't work as well because of that weight. And again, weight gain is so common in an underactive thyroid that it can increase your risk of that as well as type 1 diabetes. And the final test is a celiac screen. Celiac disease is where your own immune system attacks your gut in response to a part of wheat called gluten. So because it's also autoimmune, you're at an increased chance of getting celiac disease. To flip the coin the other way, celiac disease can also cause symptoms that are similar to an underactive thyroid. Another reason that it's important to check. So that's thyroid test, but if you want to learn a little bit more about the symptoms that actually can lead to you thinking about getting these tests, have a look at my video on thyroid symptoms. So that's it. I hope it's been helpful. Everything today was for informational purposes only, and my disclaimer is down below. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.